Yaad e Isnaal, Michelle Enfield Janisha, Trachini, Inchle, Sitnajini e Bashchin, Tohana Eda Shache, Twadachini Eda Shinale, Di Hut Al Dina Inchle, Di Hut Al Nagle Inchle. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michelle Enfield, and I will be giving the land acknowledgement here today. I want to thank the people of this land who have been taking care of it for centuries. And as someone who comes from the Navajo Nation in Arizona and New Mexico, I want to thank them for welcoming me and here and everybody else here. And I'd also like to read from the County of Los Angeles. On November 4th, 2025, the Board of Supervisors adopted a motion authored by Supervisor Hilda Celious to update the county-wide land acknowledgement. And here it is as written. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tatavian, Serrano, Kish, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and the reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including in no particular order, the Ferdinando Tatavian Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California, Tribal Council, Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians, Kish Nation, Yahaviatam of San Manuel Nation, San Fernando Band of Mission Indians, Coastal Band of Chumash Nation, Gabrielino Tongva Nation, and Gabrielino Tongva Tribe. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon. My name is Ricky Rosales, and I serve as an AIDS coordinator for the City of Los Angeles. Thank you for joining today's World AIDS Day webinar. Since its inception in 1988 by the UN, the commemoration of World AIDS Day has offered us a time to recommit ourselves to the fight to end HIV, regardless of the political or funding obstacles we face. We now have a 45-year history of HIV impacting people in Los Angeles, around the country, and around the world. This year's theme of Rethink, Rebuild, and Rise was developed as a unified call to action to reflect on the past, strengthen the global response through rebuilding resilient health systems, and rise to meet the remaining challenges in ending the HIV epidemic. We're faced with a tremendous burden. It's hard not to draw parallels between this current administration and the Reagan administration in the 1980s, with lack of regard for human life in the face of a public health threat, simply because it affects people that are considered otherwise disposable. Now that we have decades of knowledge amassed, research and biomedical interventions that were not available to us then, ending this epidemic is something achievable in our lifetimes, despite the odds. Since 1989, the AIDS Coordinator's Office has been committed to developing and supporting programs and policies that prevent the transmission and acquisition of HIV, and to improving the quality of life for people living with HIV in the city of Los Angeles. We focus our efforts on populations that are most impacted by the epidemic by funding programs that provide HIV education and prevention services, harm reduction and overdose prevention services, and we work on HIV and harm reduction policy and planning activities, advising the mayor and the city council on issues related to HIV and harm reduction. We also administer technical assistance grants and capacity building assistance programs to improve an agency's capacity to deliver services and provide funding and expertise for innovative research into HIV risk behaviors, prevention techniques, and technology. We've always considered ourselves to not only be a leader in programs, but leading and investing in research areas that otherwise are not receiving sufficient attention or funding. We've been proud to provide seed funding for research that influences future funding priorities by larger funding entities, which increases our impact exponentially while influencing research priorities in the broader community. This brings me to why we're here today. As I previously mentioned, the ACO focuses research efforts on overlooked and understudied communities and factors that affect their engagement in the HIV care continuum. California has the largest population of Native Americans in the entire nation, with the largest concentration of urban Native Americans residing in Los Angeles. These communities are commonly overlooked, and HIV prevention and care needs are minimally addressed, yet they are disproportionately impacted by HIV. At the time we decided to release this request for proposals for a study focusing on HIV in Native American communities, there was emerging data on the interrelationship between violence, trauma, and HIV, which resulted in negative health outcomes, including linkage and retention in HIV care. The calls for trauma-informed care began, and a narrative and cultural shift toward discussing trauma ensued. What was noticeably missing in Los Angeles was focusing on a population that we know has survived generational and present-day trauma, and how this could be present, and how this can present unique issues and also unique solutions that are culturally relevant. We hope that today's webinar will be informative and inspire new areas of local research, and most importantly, services that meet the needs of our community members and that promotes healing from trauma to strengthen HIV care engagement among Native Americans in Los Angeles. And with that, I will say thank you and pass it on to Erin Celious and Michelle Enfield, who will take us through the study. Erin Celious is the founder of Maroon Society, a Los Angeles-based public health and social policy research firm. Dr. Celious is a public health researcher who conducts studies for government agencies aimed at improving the design, implementation, and effectiveness of public health programs. This includes working with this office to update our treatment and prevention strategy, what we call our white paper, designing the goals and evaluation metrics for West Hollywood's HIV Zero initiative, and the current study that you will be hearing about today, exploring the relationship between trauma and HIV among Native American, Native community members in Los Angeles. And Michelle Enfield is a proud Navajo Two-Spirit activist whose work spans advocacy and cultural empowerment. Originally from Lukachukai, Arizona, she has called Los Angeles home for the past 18 years. With extensive experience in sexual health, she brings invaluable insight into culturally relevant issues impacting Native American Two-Spirit LGBT populations, blending her professional expertise with deep commitment to social justice and inclusion. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Ricky. I am going to share presentation. I'd just like to acknowledge this study obviously could not have taken place without the initial desire to study this important topic. It could not have taken place without Michelle Enfield, who's going to be sharing her journey later in this presentation, as well as the work of Patricia Ortega-Simó, who also was invaluable to conduct this study. So with that, healing from trauma to strengthen HIV care engagement among American Indian and Alaska Natives in Los Angeles. For the duration of the presentation, I'm going to refer to this community as Native or Natives in Los Angeles, just for brevity, not as a slight. So here's the agenda. We went over the land acknowledgement, the background of the study. I'm going to present the study results. As I'd mentioned, Michelle Enfield will be sharing her experience on the study and during, before, and after the study and her journey with that. I'll be sharing certain slides demonstrating just various communities. One of the core communities that participated in this study are Two-Spirit, and as you can see, these are historic photos that date back to the late 1800s of the existence of Two-Spirit community members among Native peoples in the United States. So the goals and objectives. The goal primarily was to understand how lifetime trauma affects HIV outcomes for Native people in the city of Los Angeles. This included documenting the prevalence of different types of trauma among Native Angelenos, examining how trauma is related to HIV status, and assessing how trauma impacts engagement in the HIV care continuum. So as Ricky had discussed, we know that trauma is often linked to the HIV care continuum. What does this mean? That means those who have experienced greater levels of lifetime exposure to trauma have more difficulty often adhering to HIV medication, staying in care, and lowering their health-related quality of life. This is really important because we know those who can maintain their HIV regimen are less likely to, are going to be virally suppressed, and they will not be able to transmit HIV to others. And so this is one of the primary factors in preventing new transmissions. We also know that Native people have historically high levels of traumatic life events. And so really the question that we explored is, for Native Angelenos, does lifetime exposure to traumatic events impact HIV prevalence and HIV care continuum, meaning their capacity to stay adherent to their regimen if they are living with HIV, or their capacity to make decisions that are going to have better health outcomes for themselves. And so we did this by conducting a case control comparison of Native community members. Half were living with HIV and half were not. All were adults, and that meaning 18 and older. And the questions that we explored include how common is trauma in our sample, in this population? How do trauma patterns differ by HIV status, meaning is someone who is living with HIV more likely to have experienced more lifetime events of trauma? And then how does trauma influence care engagement, adherence, and viral suppression? We conducted this study using mixed methods. This included 3 primary tools: a self-administered survey about support and risk for HIV care continuum prior to the interviews, and then an interviewer-administered interview using the lifetime exposure to traumatic events scale. And then finally, after that, an interview structured but still more qualitative about the barriers to adherence and resilience. We recruited, or what constitutes qualification would be someone who lives, works, resides, or receives social or health services in the county of Los Angeles. Initially, it was restricted to the city of Los Angeles, given that this is a city-funded study, but recruitment became challenging, and so we had to loosen and expand the geography from the city to the county, and it was still very challenging to recruit. But they would have to self-identify as American Indian or Alaska Native with a federally recognized tribe. They'd have to identify as gay, bisexual, transgender, or Two-Spirit. We recruited using informal networks among Native LGBTQ community members, health and social service providers, and social media. As I'd mentioned, the study could not have taken place or been completed whatsoever without Michelle Enfield's participation. We provided an incentive of $150 to $200. Michelle recruited at least 85% of all participants. And this is, I'm going to share with you the demographic profile of the participants. So 91% identified as male, or their sex at birth was male, 9% were female. In the study, this is them self-identifying. 53% identified as male, 25% trans female, and 12.5% as Two-Spirit, and 9% as trans male. About 69% identified as gay, and the remainder, 15.6%, identified as bisexual or straight. And just want to give you all a moment to see the participants and their tribal affiliation. There were, they have 21 different tribes represented in this study. Now we'll get to the results of the study. So participants had less stable housing compared to other LA residents. When we asked about having stable housing in the last 2 months, almost 20% or 1 out of 5 reported that they did not have stable housing in the last 2 months. This is about 4 times greater than homelessness or not having their own stable place to sleep in the past 5 years when we compared it to LA County residents as a whole. So that sort of demonstrating the risk profile. We know that housing is one of the primary factors that can allow someone to either stay engaged in their health regimen, in their art, their treatment plan, or even have a greater risk profile for acquiring HIV. So this is a pretty significant risk profile of the participants. Viral suppression was also lower among the participants than people living with HIV countywide. As we see in our study, this isn't statistically significant, but at the trend level, 56% of participants reported being virally suppressed compared to 62% countywide. So, you know, less, about 6 percentage points less than the county. HIV status was unrelated to sexual identity, number of sex partners, or sex role. And the way we look at this is comparing those in this study that were living with HIV versus HIV negative. There was really no distinction among sexual identity. So sexual identity was not a driving factor about HIV status. The number of sex partners in the past 6 months was also not statistically significant. There was no difference there. In fact, it's not significant, but at the trend level, those living with HIV were more likely to have fewer partners in the past 6 months, or at least report fewer partners in the last 6 months than those who were negative. It goes low, medium, and high. And there was also no greater likelihood to be a top or bottom during unprotected sex in the past 6 months when asked. You see the numbers are virtually the same. It's a little higher here for topping among HIV negative, but the results were not statistically significant. This could be potentially based on the fact that the sample was small, but was not significant. We also found that HIV status was unrelated to serosorting, drunk or high sex in the past 6 months, or asking about one's HIV status before having sex. Participants experienced extremely high levels of trauma regardless of HIV status. And while initially the hypothesis was that we would see differences by some of the other variables that I just went through, none of those were statistically significant. But what the primary result, as we see it, is just the unbelievably high rate of experiencing traumatic events. And so how we studied this is, I had mentioned that lifetime exposure to traumatic events, that's a scale that was developed and tested and validated through a variety of studies. The one that we used is the shortened version of the longer 21 item scale. But when we look at these items, these 8 questions, life-threatening illness or injury, life-threatening accident, were you ever robbed or mugged with force or weapon? Did someone that was close to you die by either suicide or some other traumatic, violent act? Were you ever forced to have sex? Were you sexually assaulted? Did you experience childhood physical assault? Were you ever threatened by a weapon, or did you ever witness someone being killed or seriously assaulted? As you see, the blue represents our participants, and the white is compared to national averages based on a variety of studies that you'll see on the next slide. But what we see is across the board, except for number 4, did you have someone that was close to you die by some type of violence? In 7 out of the 8, our participants experienced much greater lifetime exposure to trauma. We don't have to go through this, but this is just another way to see it. We'll make this available for those that want to look at some of the studies. They're sourced here, and we see our study versus the national average, and this shows the difference. So for each of these items, it's 1.7 times greater, 1.1, 2 times greater. Forced sexual contact or rape, 10 times, almost 11 times greater. Childhood physical abuse or assault, 12.5, and then threatened with a weapon, 20 times greater than the national average. To put this in context, the participants reported a mean of 3.47 of the 8 severe lifetime traumatic events. This is slightly higher than the mean of 3.4 event types reported by a nationally representative sample of post 9/11 U.S. combat veterans, assessed with the same items. They had 17 items in theirs. We had 8, but regardless, this is it puts in context how much trauma Native community members that participated experienced. Now I'm going to share with you some of the qualitative feedback from the study. So when we asked participants in the study what their greatest challenges were to health, this is what they reported, by and large. Mental health and emotional barriers like depression, social anxiety, isolation, fear of rejection, and being misunderstood was one of the primary barriers to health. Here are some of the quotes. So the greatest challenge was feeling like I had no one to turn to or no one who understood. My family immediately wanted to put me into therapy. Money, work, instability, and basic survival was another challenge to health. One of the participants reported balancing exercise, diet, sleep with a demanding job and online work hours as being a challenge. Systemic and identity-based oppression, transphobia, misgendering, pressure to assimilate, family rejection because of appearance or orientation. This came up quite a bit. Public spaces due to being trans among the trans and Two-Spirit community members that participated. That public negativity and sometimes violence was reported. Oops, missed one. And then physical health, life circumstances get in the way. This included chronic conditions, injuries, sleep insomnia, just aging and long travel for care, as well as sobriety. And so what the quote there is that managing diabetes and cardiac health plus long travel for care was reported as a challenge to health. Now, definitely want to leave people on a higher note. The lessons on resilience. So we asked participants, what have they found to be effective, and what would they share with someone else who is going through a similar experience as they have experienced? And this is what they reported back. Self-love, worthiness, and inner strength. You are your worst enemy or your biggest supporter. Value your life. You are worthy of life. Another lesson was to prioritize your health first. Above others' opinions, put yourself before expectations, stigma, or discrimination. They said that your health comes first before anything else, more than satisfying other people's opinions. Seeking help, community, and supportive partners. It was important for many participants to communicate to others that there is help and improving treatment out there. But you have to ask for it and be willing to walk through the door. And finally, staying resilient and keep moving forward. Quote that we liked is that even when you hit roadblocks and discrimination, don't give up. There's always another source of help. And with that, hopefully uplifting result, I am going to turn it over to Michelle Enfield.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Erin. And thank you, everybody here, for being with us today. As we know that the federal administration is not commemorating World AIDS Day. And so we, as advocates and workers in the fight, must really come together and continue to do what we do best, and that is to really share our strength, our resilience, and our hope. And that as I move forward with my section on this report back, in the spirit of the importance of information sharing, more specifically for World AIDS Day, but just in general, I will share freely in hopes that the information that I share from a personal point of view, and also from the numbers that Erin just presented to you, that my efforts and that our efforts will continue to help others to avoid becoming HIV positive, and also that those who are HIV positive receive care, and that everybody takes care of themselves. Really quick, there's a slide that I want to show briefly, which is going to be sort of a marker on what I'm going to be covering in my my section. Erin, if you could share that slide. So these are the portions of the study. These are the 3 sections that I'm going to highlight: the stressful life events, and before HIV diagnoses, and most important lesson. As somebody who, I don't know, and I have to say this before moving on, I am not used to this format in presenting. I am used to seeing people's faces and their smiles and their agreements or disagreements or the head nodding and what have you. And so in my mind, I'm going to think of everybody smiling and nodding and getting me. And so I used to be a program coordinator of a health program specifically for Native American, Two-Spirit, and GBT individuals, which was really great on the surface, in that what this study is for. And so I had this connection to a large amount of people. But the first challenge is that a lot of people did not want to partake in this study because of the stigma surrounding HIV and care or no care. And also another challenge that arose was that there were individuals who were coming forth who I self-identified as Native American or Alaska Native or Indigenous. However, upon or after their initial screening, we found that they were not culturally within the Native American or Indigenous lifestyle. And so that was another challenge that took place. Another challenge that took place was after we moved from the parameters of the city to county. Well, it was a challenge, but also it was beneficial and quite eye-opening, is that people started responding from a long place from Los Angeles City. And growing up on the Navajo Nation, I grew up watching media. And even Navajos growing up on the reservations, I learned the stigma about the valley. And so that's why I find it kind of, a challenge. And also, it was really good to get outside the city to go to the valley to meet people where they were at so that we could interview and get really in-depth conversations about what really is happening with the Native community. Those were a lot of the challenges. And as I reflect back on the the questions, the stressful life events, um, and this is where I'm going to really um, talk from a personal point of view and also from my professional point of view, because when this study began in 2016, I believe, I, like I said, I was working with the Native American HIV prevention program, and I was HIV negative. And I was also in sobriety. And from that point onward, during my timeline, I had relapsed and I also became HIV positive. So this study in going over it with Dr. Celious and really looking at the numbers and the effects and also the causes of a lot of people's view and perspective on HIV, especially Native Americans, or specifically Native Americans. This is very personal to me. And so with that being said, when I reflect on some of the questions that were involved in the study, when I was looking at stressful life events, and as I was relating to the individuals and asking them these things, in the back of my head, at the time, I was thinking about what is it and where are the gaps in services that could be filled. There were questions of long-term illnesses, accidents, and the most striking area in this stressful life events questionnaire that came out at the time and that are really significant to me today are the questions of weapons being used against you and also the mental and emotional abuse. And the mental and emotional abuse, there were examples of people ridiculing you and also calling you no good, which is a huge amount of, which causes a huge amount of pain, but also in the moment when, let me see, I think that the physical pain, speaking from my personal point of view, is that the physical pain I could get over. It's something that my body will release, bruises will fade, and I will be able to use my arm because I too had some of these occurrences. But the emotional and the mental abuse, these are things that stay with me for a long time and stay with others also for a long time. And this made me think about in the future questions. There were prompts that would be asked about health providers, and these were open-ended questions. And in retrospect, I just feel that this is probably a lesson learned that we could maybe emphasize mental health providers for any future studies to really hit on that, because this is HIV. I think that people thought that they were mostly, when they think of health providers, that they're thinking about their medical doctors and not necessarily their psychiatrists. And And so that's my reflection on the stressful life events. The second bullet point of mine is that was before HIV diagnoses. Now, once again, health providers, there was a question about what are your biggest challenges? And let me just go through, okay, let me rearrange my thought process. And I just wanted to touch on all of these things that I presented on my slide, but then I'll come and I'll talk from a really personal point of view. So in the before HIV diagnosis, there were problems about employment, your living situation, substance use, sex, and there were questions specifically about health providers and biggest challenges in accessing those health providers. And then also the last part is on what is the most important lesson. And that question actually, the whole of that question was, what is the most important lesson we can share with others about managing their health? When I woke up this morning, I went to Instagram and I was looking around for inspiration for any World AIDS Day banners and who was talking about it. And there weren't as many as there had been in the past. There were a lot of people showing people like Elizabeth Taylor and just a lot of sort of old stuff. There were a few that were put up today by Madonna, Alexandria Billings, Dominic Jackson, Jamie Lee Curtis, just to mention a few. And it's important that we see and that we continue doing this work. The study has hit me in so many various ways. I want to go back to my story a little bit more about when I started this study. The study, I was employed, I was HIV negative, I had it going on. And during the study, I found myself in a situation where I was beginning to feel emotionally and mentally really challenged. And so I resigned from my job thinking that I was going to resign before I caused any other damage around me, and I want to take care of myself. But in that thought process, my taking care of myself was really taking care of others in that I wouldn't jeopardize anybody else's programming, anybody else's um, services. And I relapsed. And when I think about the stressful life events and the mental and emotional abuse from the very, very young age, being two-spirit, there was a challenge. I mean, we hear that in the Native community that there are traditions and that there is acceptance of two-spirit individuals within the community. However, there is also so much colonization that happens, and the thought process gets warped, even from our eldest elder. Some of their teachings get warped, and they don't really adhere to or continue to to educate the new generation on how sacred life is and that everybody is sacred. And so growing up on the Navajo reservation, although I was accepted by my family for being me and just being me, there were a lot of challenges from students, from family members who weren't immediate that didn't understand. And so there were a lot of hurtful words and hurtful actions that were put upon me that I continued to carry with me. And a lot of this affected my self-esteem. And if you know anything about about the 12 steps programs. Inside the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, there is a descriptor of somebody who is an addict, and that is that they are overly emotional, that they are childish, and that they're overly sensitive. And I got to tell you that I match those impeccably. And so some of those things and some of those words that were given to me when I was younger have affected me throughout my lifetime. And so when I quit my position and I was going to take care of myself, I didn't seek out any outside help. And in fact, I would rather have numbed my feelings, and which is my relapse story. And during my numbing, I thought rather than feel what I was going through, I was taking care of myself because I wasn't feeling them anymore. And in my thinking, my thought process was that there was a lot of love that I felt that I missed out on. And not only, I mean, large part of my emotional and mental distress came from my feelings of unworthiness and not being loved once again, because going through this, going through a breakup, and that was probably the impetus that started my downfall, and not wanting to really be vulnerable, and hence not seeking professional help for my situation. So in that process, I started using again, and I was seeking love the whole time. I was seeking outside validation the whole time, and not my own validation. And so as I was seeking outside love, I became HIV positive. And the one thing that I know, and I don't know, I mean, I know that this came from my own personal resilience and my own personal strength, but also from me being a health provider and me constantly telling my participants that you need to reach out for help, and that in situations where you're feeling overwhelmed, that you have to reach out. So the moment that I was told that that I tested positive for HIV, I texted my best friend in that moment. And as I got the information of what the next steps were to do, as I walked out of the building, I called my mom immediately. And I told my mom I just tested positive for HIV. And we talked a little bit, and I called my sister next. And I talked to my sister and I told her the same thing. There's a question inside the questionnaire, and that is, what has been your biggest source of support? And it has been my family. Coming to realize that it is my family that has supported me throughout my lifetime, that I was able to tell them and to immediately find some support after after I tested positive. And I drove home and I started writing. I started writing about my experience, and I started to just let it all flow out. My questions, my fears, and how I felt about myself, because I felt that I had let myself down. And during that time, it was just prior to Thanksgiving, and I had already had Thanksgiving planned to visit my family in Arizona. And luckily, there were a number of people that showed up, not just my immediate family, but I had external family that were there. And what I did was I held a family meeting, and I told everybody. There were at least 4 generations there, starting as young as 5 years old to my mother and my father. And I was able to tell them that I tested positive for HIV, I'm HIV positive, and that this doesn't necessarily mean anything bad about me. I told him that I'm on medication and that I'm taking care of myself and that I am in care and I am doing what I feel is going to be best, not only for myself, but as a person who has led groups and has been seen as a leader in my family, that that's what resilience looks like to me. And that's what I did. And so since then, after being diagnosed with HIV and being unemployed for quite some time and relapsing, I was able to come back and finish this study. Not only was I an interviewer, but I'm also a subject in the study. And it's very important, like I say, that we do what we do so that our efforts will continue to assist people affected by HIV. And to all of this, I want to wrap up with what is the most important lesson we can share with others about managing their health? There are so many answers to this that I received while interviewing individuals, but also that I had answered, and it may differ from what I said in this study, but this here, being with you all today, sharing my experience as a professional and also as a patient, that I, my, the important lesson that I share is that we just continue to keep talking about all of the effects of HIV, whether they are positive or negative, and that sharing our experiences and our strength and our hope, that we can help others and help ourselves, whether you are HIV positive or not. You are here for a reason, and that reason is that we are health providers and that we are doing the most. And so I hope that I've put this together in some sense that that really highlights the importance of this study, and that it highlights the importance of the people who live and work and receive services in not only Los Angeles City, but in Los Angeles County. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ricky.
I'll take it real quick, actually. First, before we go into the Q&A, I just want to thank you, Michelle, so much for sharing your personal journey as both a receiver of services as well as one of the pinnacle important folks working in the study. The study would not have happened if it wasn't for you, and for you to come here and share your journey with us is a very special gift that you've given to everybody in this room. So wanted to just thank you for that. And feel free to give some love to Michelle in the chat if you'd like. And we are going to transition to the Q&A. And so this is an opportunity if there's anything for either Aaron or for Michelle that you'd like to ask. We have about 10 minutes or so. So feel free to raise your hand and come off mute. Hey, even come on video if you'd like. And we can just have a conversation with our guests. So anybody have any questions? Thanks, folks in the chat. Desiree, feel free to come off mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to share that actually my boss asked me to sign up for this event, which I am very happy that I joined this meeting because I could say that I have learned a lot, and I just want to personally thank Michelle for sharing her story. I can tell that you're a very incredibly strong person, and um I want to thank everyone for making this a safe space for Michelle to share her story with us. Again, that's all really I gotta say. Thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. Anybody else have any questions, comments, anything you'd like to engage with Michelle or Aaron about? It was so thorough that I guess, or people are shy, one or the other. Oh, we have a question. What can be done next? Any recommendations for the future?
I'd like to make a comment on that, Dahlia. I think in having a conversation with Michelle and some of the comments that she made today, it made me think of a question that we didn't ask that I think would be helpful to ask in any future studies, and that is, you know, we see how high the levels of traumatic experiences are among Native people in this country. And it made me think, to what extent does that normalize traumatic events such that we don't understand how normalizing it, growing up in a situation or a community, a family or household where trauma or traumatic experiences are normalized, how does that impact one's behavior in a way that's going to help or make it more difficult to be healthy? And I think it would have been helpful had we asked after being asked about their experiences of traumatic events, do you believe that this was unique to you, or did you know others who experienced this as well? I mean, some of the scale dealt with that, but I think that would have been a nice addition to understand. So that's what I would think would be next on some level.
Michelle, do you have any thoughts on what would be next?
Nothing very specific, however, that this is sort of the introduction to this new study, that definitely people who are on here could disseminate this and pass it on, pass it forward, because when I was program coordinator of the Native American Help program, there wasn't there wasn't this specific type of information that was so close to home. And I think that sharing it locally definitely would help make an impact. And also, I would definitely like to see something maybe like what the local Native Americans think about it and get their feedback on the study and the numbers and how they feel. Maybe that there are certain nonprofits that could also provide feedback, insight into this.
Thank you, Michelle. We have time for one last question or comment, and then we will close us up. All right, seeing none, I will turn it over to Ricky.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Michelle. This was a great presentation. I am looking forward to getting more details. We will make the report available in the next couple of months. We're trying to dot the I's and cross the T's. We will disseminate it as widely as possible, and hopefully we can come back together this time in person to present a little bit more detail and maybe have conversations with more of the participants if they are available and interested. And we will also be making the recording of this webinar available through our website, and I think we may be able to email it out to the participants as well. So with that, I hope everyone has a good sort of World AIDS Day. Make sure to remember everyone that we have lost people in our lives. And again, thank you to Aaron and Michelle for all the great work and for the great stories. Thank you.